Hello and welcome to the video. I was recently making a video where I needed to find an FTDI adapter. Now, for those of you that have been in the hobby for a couple of years, you probably don't know what an FTDI adapter is. And as part of that exploration, I uncovered all of this stuff that, quite frankly, needs to go in the bin. I had bags of this stuff back from when I did an awful lot of building. So what I'm going to do in this video is kind of go through some of the stuff that I found in here, which kind of documents the early days of the multi-rotor and drone revolution, because these days we are a little bit spoilt. The flight controllers we have work really well. Software is very sophisticated. The way everything plugs into and onto the flight controllers is really well thought out. So I thought, you know what, while I've got all this stuff in front of me, let me go through, for those of you that might remember this, it'll be a trip down memory lane. For those of you that came into the hobby after about 2006, 2007, some of this is going to be news, but this is where all of the flight controllers and stuff came from. The majority of them can kind of trace their lineage back to these things. Now, the first flight controller we're going to talk about is this thing here. This is the KK 2.0. Wasn't the first version of the KK boards. Copter control is what KK stands for. This was the one, though, that everyone got really, really excited about. This one's hidden away inside of my Armatan quad. This quad was actually built for me by Chris at Armatan. It's my first ever real multi-rotor, so I just can't get rid of it, and I'm not going to change anything. This was for me the start of a love affair, a renewed love affair with radio controlled flying, because before this it'd just been really radio controlled helicopters and a bit of fixed wing, but this gave me the bug big time. Now, looking back on the channel, it's very funny to see the first videos I did on the KK 2.0 would have been in June 2013. Looking at those videos now, they're running at something like 153,000 views. Now, I actually had this from, I think, January that year. So I've been flying multi-rotors now for over 7 years. The modes on this thing were really basic. I only had a self-level mode and kind of a rate mode, but you could set up everything through the buttons and the screen. You didn't have to try and connect it to anything. You didn't need a computer. It was all self-contained, and that was part of the attraction. The next series that I did, and it was really my first proper series, because so many people in the forums back then had done stuff on the copter control that I didn't think I could add anything to it. I was doing a couple of videos, but in terms of how you set it up, it was all pretty straightforward. I was on holiday. I remember it distinctly. I was actually out in Florida with my wife and got an email on the phone. And looking at the email, I kind of couldn't believe it, really. Somebody wanted to send me a flight controller for free. And it was this thing called a Multiwe. And then I spent 2 or 3 days. I was actually on a little laptop. I remember taking it on holiday with us so I could keep track of things at work. And I spent the next 2 or 3 days trying to figure out how you set up and used a Multiwe, because I had experience of the KK 2.0, but the Multiwe was a very, very different proposition. Now, the first series for the Multiwe SE started when I got back from holiday in August 2013. Looking at those videos, has 80,000 odd plus views now for that initial video of the series. And I did do a complete series showing how you went through each individual step and how you all set it up. As I figured it out, I kind of then created content to help others in places like the forums who were just struggling to do this. Because the way it worked was that you needed to compile the code yourself. You needed to go and get yourself an Arduino compiler. You need to download all these files. You need to actually edit the code and comment out things that you didn't want, uncomment the board type that you're using, then compile it, then flash it. You needed an FTDI adapter. See, that's where we all started this video. To plug it into the computer. It was tricky to set up. You had to be pretty technically competent, and you had to be very committed to go through and learn all this stuff. If your brain wasn't naturally suited to thinking about programming and computers, then this was a hopeless proposition for you. The interesting thing is when it went together, and you got it set up, it worked incredibly well. It's only a little 8-bit processor on this thing. The reason it's called Multiwe is because back in the day, the very early versions of it, before it was turned into these little cute boards that you could get, and I used the 2.5 SE version when I was doing all of my builds, because back in the day what they do is they'd have a little flight control board, but they would take apart the controller from a Wii, which had the gyroscopes and accelerometers, and you kind of wire that in, and that would be how the flight controller kind of sensed its movement, hence Multiwe. So it's a bit of a weird name, but the GPS flight modes on it worked incredibly well. GPS hold, GPS return to home, all that stuff was amazingly resilient, and I added it to quite a lot of copters. In fact, built copters for friends who saw mine and just went, I've got to have one of them. So I did an awful lot of Multiwe stuff and extra bits, adding bits and pieces on those series. Now fast forward about a year, now talking in middle of 2014, and 2014 is when I first started dabbling with something called APM. Now APM, 8-bit processor, remember this is a long time ago, we're not into 32 bits, everything's 8-bit at the moment, 8-bit processor, and it's running Ardu Pilot. For those of you that do things with Pixhawk or have been watching the channel, you know that Ardu Pilot is still very much alive and very much a fabulous option if you want a bulletproof build, and APM was exactly that. It's what we used to use if you were building a professional setup. Loads of connections, setup was really easy, the user interface mission planner looked very similar to how it does now, and there was a kind of wizard or a process that you went through. The documentation was light years ahead of other stuff and still is. The Ardu Pilot wiki is still one of the best repositories of information in my humble opinion, and the GPS flight modes were a whole nother level. Not only could you do things like GPS hold, if you'd use a multi-rotor and GPS return to home, where it would come home to you and it would land and disarm itself, which blew people's minds. You could also do things autonomously, so you could set it up and tell it where you want it to fly, at what height, at what speed, and it would do it all itself. And this is the ancestor of the Pixhawk and all the technology that we have now. So APM hasn't been a valid choice for a long time, but an incredibly popular platform. Lots of people are still using it, even though it isn't supported in the latest versions of Ardu Pilot. And you can see that by the number of views, over 550,000 views on that series. The next flight controller is one that sparked a lot of controversy over nothing more than how you pronounce its name. The Nazi32 or the Naze32, depending on how you want to say it. I had lots of people shouting me at both sides of the fence on that particular one. If I said Nazi32, everyone said it's not Nazi, it's Naze, and vice versa. So in the end, I just called it whatever I felt like. The Nazi32 was the start of the revolution. Nazi32, I did my series back in January 2015, checking the view count on that, over 385,000 views on that series from January 2015. Using an F1 processor, we have now jumped into 32-bit technology. And what's happened is the code that was running on that little 8-bit Multiwe board that worked so well, but there was a pig to install and set up, has now been turned into a 32-bit version by a gentleman called Timecop. Now, Timecop called that base flight, and a gentleman called Dominic Clifton back then took that code, which because it had gone from kind of 8 to 32-bit, and the minimum had been done to kind of move it across, and Timecop had done a great job getting it to work on a 32-bit processor. Dominic took that and then started to clean that code up, and he called it Clean Flight. And Clean Flight is the place that we've got things like Betaflight and iNav Flight from today. So we owe both Timecop and especially Dominic Clifton a huge debt of thanks, because without them we wouldn't have some of the technology that we rely on to fly today. Setup was an awful lot easier. There was a graphical user interface. I know this looks absolutely nothing like what Clean Flight did. This was versions of Clean Flight ago, where it was a very simple setup, but the Nazi32 had a USB port. Hallelujah, you could plug it in, you could do all the flashing, all the configuration was in a graphical user interface. It was a lot easier to set up and it performed really nicely. However, it wasn't all good news. We did lose something in the translation of that 8-bit code from Multiwe into the 30-bit code that eventually became Clean Flight. The GPS flight modes were jiggered, and didn't work very well at all. If you got them to work, you were the exception rather than the rule. And unfortunately, that was the way it stayed for a very long time, because everyone realized that you could put a Nazi 32 or NAS 32 into a multi-rotor relatively easily and it would fly great. And that meant that the point of entry for this stuff was lowered because the Nazi 32 was an awful lot cheaper, the setup was a lot easier. I did my video series and everyone started building quadcopters left, right and centre, and things like the rotors started to be designed for multi-rotor specific motors, as well as rotors and props were designed as well. Frames started to be built and everybody started to jump on that bandwagon as it started to build pace. Now, there was a flight controller that I was a little late to, and that was the CC3D. I did my series in April 2015, looking at the view count, about 239,000 plus views on those videos. Now, CC3D was one that people got in touch with me back in the day and went, oh, the Nazi 32 is really good, but have you tried this? And I got a couple in and played with them and was blown away. It used a completely different operating system, firmware from Clean Flight, like the Nazi 32 was. It was called OpenPilot. Now, OpenPilot was a spectacular piece of code. It had a brilliant setup wizard. It was really simple to put together. The way that the board had been designed wasn't just designed from a technical perspective. It also felt like it had been designed by somebody who thought about how people were going to build multi-rotors. So putting a quadcopter together with a CC3D was an absolute joy, and you couldn't get something wrong that when you tried to fly the thing it flips over and destroyed itself, or tried to fly it into you. All of the things about how the controls had to move, calibration, flight control, modes, all that stuff was set up by the wizard. It was the thing that I pointed everyone towards if they were doing a new build. And if you got the CC3D Revo, which was the more expensive version, then you could also put a GPS on there as well and get some GPS flight modes too. Now, fortunately, the CC3D, again, because of its slow processor, is something that you don't really see anymore. I think there was some updated versions. There's now updated versions of the OpenPilot project. That project died a death, and then we had things like LibrePilot and others kind of took that project and ran on with them. I really do miss OpenPilot. It was one of the few bits of technology for the hobby that really thought about what the user needed, particularly those builders who hadn't built multi-rotors before, and kind of walked them through the process to avoid all the standard pitfalls. And the last flight controller is one that some of you will remember, which is the Seriously Pro Racing F3, or the SP Racing F3. Now, the SP Racing F3 was designed by Dominic Clifton. You remember that name? I talked about him a while ago. He was the gentleman that took base flight and turned it into clean flight. He then, very, very clever chap, Dominic, he then went and decided to design a flight controller using an F3 base version of the same 32-bit processor. So rather than be F1, it was F3, and that gave a huge increase in the amount of processing power that meant that clean flight could be developed and do so much more stuff. Now, this SP Racing F3 had a load more connections. It was set up in exactly the same way, so if you knew what you were doing was a Nazi 32 or NAS 32, still at it, then you could set up the SP Racing F3. The SP Racing F3 had loads of extra pins on it. Also things like, you could add WS2812 addressable LEDs, you could put your GPS on it, you could do all kinds of really cool stuff. Now, unfortunately for Dominic, it probably became the fastest and most cloned board in the history of the hobby. Once manufactured in China saw what a breakthrough the SP Racing F3 was, they all made their own version. So although Dominic did all the hard work, unfortunately he didn't reap the benefits. And even flight controllers today that come out are at the underlying level kind of hardware compatible with how he designed that initial SP Racing F3. And from there, we have continued to build on the hobby. So after the SP Racing F3, then the F4 boards came out and everyone said that we'd never need F4 because there was far too much processing power. Then F3 now isn't really supported. So all of the flight controllers that I've talked about are old hat. And if you're thinking of building, even if you find those really old series, don't build on them. Build on one of the modern flight controllers. Pick a build series that I've done in the last year or two, or check out my kit picks videos that I tend to do every July or August every year to just kind of tell you what I would be picking if I was doing a build. Hopefully that has been interesting for those of you that have been in a hobby for a long time. You may have seen the faces of a couple of old friends there and things that you remember from your early building days. For me, it was one of those really fun things to pull these things out of the spares bins at the bottom of the spares bins and kind of go, what the heck is that? Oh my, look, that's a Nazi 32, Nace 32. And to put them on one side. And I was just going to put them all in the bin because I need to make space in the spares bins for current generation technology. But I thought, you know what? Let's actually document some of this, because if it puts the same kind of daft grin on your face as it did for me, then that means it was worthwhile making the video. So be good to each other, stay well and safe, and as always, happy flying. Thank you for watching my video and watching right to the very end. If you want to find out what I'm currently working on, you can follow me on social media by searching for Painless360 in the usual places. If you'd like to become part of the inner circle, then you can become a Patreon. Details are in the description and you get lots of additional benefits. Check out the playlist section on the channel too. I organise all of my videos into playlists, and it's called something like Introduction to or for Beginners. All of the content is aimed so that you can start at the very beginning, and it teaches you that subject, starting with simple principles and moving up to teach you everything you need to know.